Chapter 19. The Brink of Insanity. It was winter, and despite Southern California's reputation, it was cold and windy. But in my cell, my coldness was not entirely from the weather. I had even felt it in the hot grip of summer. I had the covers over my head, refusing to face the early morning light. An image of a pair of pliers flickered in my mind. They were clamped tight against a rod or bar or something. It looked like metal at first, but it was softer. It was like dirt or clay. It was cracking and crumbling under the pressure of the tightening pliers. That was me, caught in the middle. The squeeze was on, but who was squeezing the pliers? The attempted escape and failure had polarized things more clearly in SSU. Pat and Leslie were just about finished with Mary and Kathy. They didn't give a damn about us and what it would cost us when they tried to go out here and blew it. Leslie had complained bitterly during one of those rare moments when she would talk to me. We're all lumped in with them in everyone's eyes, and will suffer for their screw-ups. Meanwhile, Mary and Kathy saw the other two as dead skunks in the middle of the road, a line borrowed from a song playing on the radio a lot in those days. It was funny at first, until the deadly seriousness sank in. We still hadn't escaped from our habit of deriving reality from the unrealities of recorded music. I'm stuck in between, I thought. This is crazy. Is this just gonna be one endless road of attempts and failures at breaking out of here? With Pat and Leslie yipping and yapping from the other side? What if they do break out? Can I take this endless monotony of Pat and Leslie's ignoring Susan game? How long can I stand up to all this crap anyway? I rolled over but kept the covers over my head. Why don't I just blow it? Nobody gives a damn anyway. None of these crazy women care, and the staff. They're just fucking pigs, paid to watch me and make sure I don't go anywhere. I'm losing my mind. A hurricane raged in me. What if I go crazy? Who'll clean up my room? That was uppermost in my mind, and there was nothing funny about it. What about my embroidery? I thought. That wasn't funny either. I've got to be able to function at least. No one can know I'm going fucking crazy. If I just nod my head and act like I understand and am right there with them, they'll never know the difference. 'Cause they really don't care. Not even Kathy and all her fine talk. She's just using me anyway, and I'm the duck that's going for it. I flung the covers back and quickly stood up, my heavy nightgown falling to my ankles. I looked out into the corridor. Why don't they open my door? I've got to get outside. I yelled into the corridor. Mr. Henry, please open the door. I've got to get outside. Our middle-aged guard, Mr. Henry, came quickly down the hall. He looked into my room. Susan, are you all right? No, damn it, I'm not. Will you please let me outside? I've got to get some fresh air. I didn't realize it until I started to move, but my face was wet with tears. My nose was running. I could hardly see. Okay. And the kindly guard said, come on. The tears were hot like lava on my face. I felt like someone deep in the throes of the flu. He opened my door and then the door to the yard. I plunged out, barefooted and without a coat. The cold air hit my burning face with a whoosh. My hot face and breath formed a mist all about my head. It was like a fog on the moors. I stepped across the ice-cold pavement onto the yellowed grass. It was freezing. I hugged my sides with my arms and burst across the yard. I've got to maintain, I yelled inside myself. I've got to maintain. I spoke sharply to the guard. I'm going crazy, Mr. Henry. It wasn't a scream. It was merely a statement. I'm going crazy. The waves broke over me and I sobbed uncontrollably. It seemed that the sobs were outside me at first, but then I knew they were from down inside my bowels. My cries mingled with the twittering of the morning birds, damnation and beauty running together in the wintry morning. I've got to stop, I said to myself. No one must see me cry. They mustn't see me blow it. Who's going to get me dressed? Who's going to take care of my room? Oh my God, I'm losing my mind. Suddenly, I stopped. Mr. Henry, what day is it? Please tell me what day it is. He stood close to me, a fatherly man, deeply anxious. It's going to be all right, Susan. It's going to be all right. I pushed him away. No, it's not all right. I'm blowing it and I don't know why. No one can help me. I'm losing my mind. I was caught completely off guard by a soothing voice, beautifully low-pitched, a woman's voice. Susan, listen to me. The words were like a soft violin, and I felt the reassuring touch of Kathy's arm on my arm. I turned and through blurred, burning eyes met Kathy's firm, steady gaze. My head felt swollen from the explosions within it as I wrestled with the words coming from her full, pretty lips. Susan, listen to me. I could tell she feared I was gone, so I struggled for control, to give her a sign of recognition. I'm blowing it, Kathy. I'm blowing it. I spoke as softly and clearly as I could imagine. Her face held even. Okay, so you're blowing it. Come on inside where it's warm. You could blow it in there just as well. She led me back into the unit, like a mother leading a child who had gone astray, past doors that seemed to be full of peering eyes and quizzical, although slightly frightened looks. Mutterings and mumblings rolled into my flooded mind. She's gone crazy. At last. So what else is new? Kathy led me into the visiting room. But where was Mr. Henry? Oh, he was probably making some coffee. That was all we ever did anymore. Make coffee, eat, sleep, make coffee. This was crazy. Why hadn't they just killed me and gotten it over with? Kathy. The words spewed out. I'm not able to maintain anymore. It's like one long acid trip, and it's a bummer. Man, a real bummer. Kathy said nothing for several seconds. We both sat at the mall table in the visiting room. Susan, if you decide to go crazy, know that you are deciding to go crazy. It is your decision. She paused, and her tempo increased slightly. These people here will take care of you. You don't have to worry about what you will wear, or when to take a bath, or what to eat, or anything. They'll take care of you. So if you're worried about not being able to function, don't worry about it. Just let go of the branch and fall. Baby, fall. Or else, pull yourself up and get back to the edge and hold on. She seemed so confident. That was the most impressive thing about the moment. Yet her words made sense in my drowning mind. If you let go, you'll only have to land once. If you get back up on the ledge, you may have to jump to get over this gaping hole in your life. But one thing is for sure, you can't hold on to a branch forever, Susan. Kathy got up from the table and walked around the little room. Her steps were soundless on the carpeted floor. She was still in her nightgown. I've told you before, woman, you have 4 ways to go. Do you remember that time out in the yard a few weeks ago? And you were wondering what you should do because of my first bust? I told you I'd try again, remember? And I invited you to go with me. The way was still open. That was one way. Or, I said, you could sit here in prison and rot or die. Because you're not a good convict. Your reputation out there on Mainline ain't exactly Susie Cream Cheese, you know. Or, I said, you could become a Jesus freak and preach your way out of prison. Lots of people are going that route. You see them all the time on TV, and they're always writing to you to try and save your soul. She laughed, but I didn't. I wondered inside. What's so bad about someone wanting to save my soul? I didn't dare say it out loud because I was no match for her philosophy. She believed all souls were saved already, or something like that. Or, she continued as she paced, you can go crazy and flip out into Never Never Land. The chance you take there is this. There's no guarantee that you'll ever return to reality. She stopped speaking and walking, staring down at me in the chair. It looks to me, Susan, like you've begun to make your choice. Is this what you want? If so, then let go of the branch and fall, baby. She turned abruptly and walked out of the room, passing Mr. Henry, who was bringing a cup of coffee to me. Like a zombie, coffee cup in hand, I walked back outside into the cold air. There were no leaves on the trees. They were like gray skeletons. The grass was like dirty straw stubble. Standing transfixed, looking out across the distant cow pastures and then onto the blue-gray mountains, I spotted a spider's web. It was woven between the 2 of steel strands in the fence around the SSU yard. As I watched, the web seemed to take the shape of a whirlpool, swirling down away into grayness. I'll be damned if I go crazy, I said half aloud. I'm not going to let go. I'm not sure if I continued speaking aloud or not. I know Mr. Henry was watching from a distance, but no one else was near. I'll die if I escape. They'll no doubt shoot me. I'm not clever or tough enough to make it on the run for long. And I can't stand rotting in prison forever. What does that leave me? Become a Jesus freak and preach my way out? Even in my twisted condition, I laughed. Who would believe me if I turned to God? The foulest mouth in the prison. The one with the deepest hate for everyone and everything here. The one with the temper tantrums and gross attitudes toward anything good. The one with so much guilt and self-condemnation buried under an attitude of I don't give a damn. The one who feels guilty just for feeling guilty. Who would believe somebody like that? There had to be another way. I could feel the stains on my face. It was stiff and scratchy. The coffee mug was cold in my hands, but I could feel the sun starting to warm my back. I'll just have to take it a step at a time, I said, turning to look at the grim SSU building. If I don't turn loose of the branch, then I've got to find reality. I've got to find the truth. Does anyone know the truth? What is that anyway? It's a dumb word. My eyes landed on Mr. Henry. I've got to stop thinking, I said to myself, or I will go crazy. I'll start thinking tomorrow. Yes, tomorrow. I went back to my bed. Mary and Kathy made one more effort to escape. Again, they were unsuccessful. They got their bars sawed through, but they never got outside their rooms. They had managed to hide their hacksaw blades in some book bindings after the first debacle, and no amount of searching by the staff, even in our flower gardens out in the yard, with metal detectors and all other modern devices and techniques, turned up anything. Much of the relaxed attitude that had developed among the staff and us over the previous 2 years vanished, at least for a while. Both Mary and Kathy received bad reports, called CDC 115s, for their files. Eventually, the storm passed and Catherine was ultimately released from the prison. I had no explanation for her early departure beyond her own claims that she was a white witch who could postulate anything and see it pass, whether with prison authorities or anyone else. She also was a master con artist. As for Mary, she was not released from the prison, but she was eventually removed from SSU and placed in the mainline population at CIW. The three of us who had declined to join in the escape attempts remained in the special security unit. Such are the vagaries of prison life. Chapter 20. The Blowing Wind. It was early in January 1974, and a number of currents within my life were moving at the same time. All related perhaps, but not always obviously so. I had made an all-out commitment to find the truth and to being honest in that search. Kathy and Mary's second escape attempt was still in the planning stage, and I was equivocating on what I might do regarding them, although I felt pretty much as I had before. This was not my time. In addition to my embroilment with truth, I was caught up in one of those crazy affairs that had happened so often in prisons. I had decided that I wanted to be real as well as truthful and honest, and reality in my jangled mind meant possibly settling down with one man, with whom I might one day live out the remainder of my life, no matter how many years it took. I fell overboard with a man who had began to write to me from another California prison. I believe I genuinely fell in love with him, to the extent that that's possible from afar, even though I sensed somehow that he might be playing me for a fool. I was so blinded that I figured the reality of my love would convert any frivolity on his part. I felt that genuine love was stronger than any game that he could be playing on me. I wrote over and over to this man, Johnny, about our love and, among other things, the need to develop Christ consciousness as the center of our relationship if we wanted it to work. Johnny wrote back, "That is where I'm coming from too, Susan." And I believed it. As it turned out, neither of us had the slightest idea of what we were talking about. I had come across the term Christ consciousness in my philosophy ratings in connection with the University of Santa Cruz workshops. It sounded so good that I adopted it. Johnny also latched onto it. One day, I received a letter from Johnny, nearly a year after we had begun writing. I opened the envelope and read hungrily. It was a typical letter, but strangely the name Susan didn't appear anywhere in it. It was full of the name Carol. It dawned on me. I had received someone else's letter. It was from Johnny, all right, but it was not for Susan. Johnny had mixed up the letters. It turned out that he was quite a man. He had been carrying on romances with women all over the state. I, in my first attempt at total honesty, had walked right into dishonesty. I crumbled. My little dream world of a white cottage and pretty flowers and a normal life with a true husband collapsed. I took several giant steps backward emotionally. I thought I had reached the point where I could make decisions for myself, trust my own feelings and judgment, and move into reality and truth. But that confidence blew up in my face. Wrong again. Forever wrong. I would never trust anyone again. Never. And then, along in here, overlapping with the numerous forces working at that time, came old Bruce from the family days. I had first met Bruce, who was 4 or 5 years older than I, when we were moving around Topanga Canyon. Shortly after our meeting, we became lovers and shared our lives quite intimately until we went to Spawn's ranch. Then old Bruce, to be distinguished from new Bruce, the father of my son, disappeared for about a year. Having traveled around the world, he ended up at Spawn's for lack of anywhere else to go. Many of the girls at Spawn's thought old Bruce was conceited and arrogant, which was probably true, although he was always kind and gentle to me. Many put him down because he looked quite a bit like Charlie, although Bruce was far more rugged and stocky, and no guy was permitted to stack up well against Charlie. Bruce was only about 5'6.5" tall, which strengthened the resemblance, but he always looked as though he were on the verge of growing a beard. Pretty raggedy. He was valuable to Charlie in the dune buggy days because of his welding skills and his overall confidence in getting things done. Bruce, sentenced to life in the Hinman Shea cases, was in Folsom Prison. Since we were co-defendants in the Hinman matter, we were allowed to write each other as long as we dealt with the case. I received a message in February 1974 that he wanted to write me, and I arranged for permission for us to exchange letters. It wasn't long before we were writing on a regular basis. First 2 or 3 times a week, but then practically daily. I told him about my commitment to truth and honesty, and he constantly held me to it, snapping me back on track after my escapade with Johnny. I reckoned you'd snap sooner or later, he said in his first letter after my blow-up, and urged me to get on with my quest for truth. Probably the most important thing about that letter for me at that moment was the way he ended it. Peace and be cool. I love you. He seemed so calm and very cool himself, unlike the man I had first encountered 6 years earlier. From then on, he asked questions that reached down inside me, questions that challenged my pledge to seek truth above all things. He had an incredible way of saying something that he believed to be truth, which would infuriate me and my warped sense of reality, and then hanging on until I argued myself back and forth and around to his original statement. He kept me constantly puzzled, refusing to lay anything on me as the only truth, but telling me just enough about what he thought to spur me on to think through the truth myself. It didn't take long for me to see that Bruce had an unusual consistency about him. His attitudes toward life, the horrible past, the difficult present, and the uncertain future. seemed to hold firm and to not wobble the way mine did. In short, he seemed much more together than I was, and I determined to keep writing and nagging at him until I had what he had. Because of the necessity to maintain at least a facade of communication about our legal situations, our letters contained a lot of references about other cases and were rather restricted and cautious, especially at first. But this was gradually eased, although we continually included legal references. A significant breakthrough in our discussions, for me, came in a letter from him dated May 6, 1974. It gave me a rare insight, although still not as plainly spoken as I'd like, into love and how Bruce felt about me. The result, by the way, of my hounding him on the subject. I had really badgered him on whether he loved me or not. It's embarrassing to look back upon it, but my insecurity was so monumental that I wanted his love and affection spelled out in black and white. And his style wasn't black and white. But he gave me a sweet taste of his love for me, and I felt warm all over as I sat on my bed reading his efforts to reassure me. He said he had always felt I was a special person, and his deepest desire was for me to realize it, and he brought it all the way down to the personal level. I had felt in previous letters that he might have been speaking of a platonic love, but the cloud lifted from me as he said he meant it personally. When he said he loved me for myself. I smiled as he attributed a lot of this love to the fact that I was like him, on the down-to-earth side. How could he think of someone like me, who had spun off in a dozen different directions all at once, as being on the down-to-earth side? But he was seeing that, inside, that was the way I wanted it. But he didn't stop there. He turned mysterious on me and started additional questions flowing. First I was excited and then doubtful about his feeling that he would see me sometime. He carefully said that only time would tell whether we'd be free together, but he raised all kinds of strange feelings within me as he wrote of such things as the world as we knew it coming to an end, and of his refusal to look at the world and the future in terms of himself and his own desires. He seemed to be looking himself right in the eye, but still not taking himself too seriously. He was smiling at himself for a change. He ended that letter with, "Peace and blessings to you." His first use of the word blessings. I was immediately aware of it and very curious. He had a way of dropping in little things like that with no further discussion, and it would take several days for my letter to raise a question and several days more for him to respond. Meanwhile, he was moving on to fresh things. It was 2 days after Mother's Day that year that he drove hard against my relativistic way of seeing things. Actually, the letter had been written on Mother's Day itself, and he had raised many varieties of emotion within me with his best wishes. My son was living with foster parents somewhere in the United States, but I had no idea where, and no expectation that I would ever see him again. But still, I was his mother, and loved him longingly. Bruce spoke of his belief that there was an absolute best way to live, an absolute best way to go, and that his problem was to find out what that way was, or better still, just to come into a realization of the way. But then he went on to say that a man alone could not figure out that best way, any more than clay could figure out how to become a pot. He said most men, in seeking solutions, had left out a necessary part of the equation. Did he mean God? It appeared so, for he went on to say that he prayed for the strength to do what was right, adding that he believed he was being made strong enough to do it right. That was troubling for someone who had been the centerpiece of her own life as long as she could remember. Bruce was too full of absolutes for me. Yet he wasn't harsh as most people who spoke of such things. He was very gentle. And he spoke of praying for the strength to do what was right. Could that be rugged, self-sufficient old Bruce? 2 days later, without flattery, came more tenderness and hope. He seemed to be constantly seeing possibilities for good in me. I had raised the issue of innocence and simple-mindedness, 2 characteristics I believed had left me. But Bruce felt that they had only retreated and held out hope for innocence reborn, born not out of blindness or ignorance, but out of love and grace. Wow, how good that sounded. Was it possible? He continued with enigmatic language that told me he not only saw good in me, but he also expected it to come forth. He seemed to have some insight into my future. It was spooky. For example, he hooked me with his own story, how he had tried so hard for years to put his own head together, getting nowhere except a Folsom. And then someone he couldn't yet see had readjusted his head. Was he talking about God again? I lay back on the firm mattress and read more. He shifted gears to point right at me, declaring that he knew I soon was going to super relax in my head long enough to look at myself squarely and laugh and cry at everything. And then, he said, I would see the way I was going. He urged me to check it out very carefully. Strangely, he closed the letter with, "Take care, beloved sister." Beloved sister? I thought I was more like his lover. He startled me a little more within a few days when he began to write about change coming in the world, the end of the age and things like that. We had both been through a lot of talk of that sort, and I wasn't sure I wanted to get into it anymore. But Bruce had an interesting point in one letter. He spoke of civilization getting ready to become something new. He said the source of this information was something that had been written by some agency that had never been wrong. I eventually figured out he was referring to the book of Revelation in the Bible. But hadn't Charlie got a lot of his wild talk out of Revelation? However, Bruce persisted in his monologue about the deterioration of the world, the corruption, the failure of governments, the rise of despots. He said one of the things he wanted most for me was to understand that we were approaching the end of the age. Drastic changes were coming. He spoke at length about the 4 horsemen in Revelation and then concluded that so-called religious leaders had rarely told the people the truth about God or Christ or what the Bible said, and what was going to happen. He came down hard on those, he said, were telling things designed to suit their own ends, those who caused pain in the name of Christianity, those who ultimately produced hostility to the whole truth of Christ with slick and tricky misconceptions. He concluded that letter tenderly, and I found tears flooding my eyes as I sat alone in my cell, by saying simply that he believed me. He was one day going to break through into understanding about life, and that he wanted those who loved with him in that breakthrough. But, he said simply, it would have to be my choice that led to my breakthrough. He couldn't force it on me. It was only 2 days later, June 12th, that he gave me a clue as to why he was thinking so much about the future of the world. He recommended a book called The Late Great Planet Earth by Hal Lindsey, a best-selling Bible volume about Bible prophecy. It was to be instrumental in drawing me more and more into what the Bible had to say about our time. But then, after getting me all turned on about the future of the world, Bruce seemed to do a quick shuffle and left me hanging. In a nutshell, he said he didn't know what the particulars of the future would be, but since God made the future possible, all he really had to do was trust God. That was the way with him, from mysteriously complex to the utterly simplistic. I reflected on this as I sat on my bed one day, keeping absolutely quiet about my letters from Bruce. I still wasn't independent enough to want my fellow SSU residents to know what I was up to. Furthermore, I wasn't even sure myself what I was up to. Bruce seems to start to say something definite and then he backs off. I thought, what is he trying to do? Maybe he doesn't really know what he means, and yet he seems so calm and assured. What is he trying to tell me? It was late afternoon. I curled into the corner of my bed and reread a section of his letter dated June 10th. He jabbed at my impatience. I chuckled and winced. He wished it was as simple as a snap of the fingers for me to find fulfillment and satisfaction. But, he said, the best thing for me to do was to dig into the Bible, especially the New Testament, disregarding what I had been led to think about it, and find some answers for myself. He hammered hard at the earlier theme that we had been given concepts that were not true, that, in fact, we had been tricked and were carrying hostility toward Christianity as a result. I tossed the letter on the bed and stared at the ceiling. Then, reaching to the box near the head of my bed, I pulled down another of many letters I was receiving from some woman named Elizabeth Burson. Like all the others, it contained a tract, but for some reason I had not thrown this one away. This woman never gives up, I thought. I had taken a lot of razzing from my co-defendants because of the letters from the Burson woman and others, including Shirley Hoffman, for whom I'd babysat in San Jose years ago. The old joke continued about everyone wanting to save Susan's soul. Why don't they just leave her alone? Kathy said rather loudly recently. They don't seem to realize her soul has been spoken for. She's already been saved. I could sense rather than see the strange smile on her face, and I wasn't really sure what she meant. I knew I wasn't saved in the sense that all those ladies were talking about in their letters. I was lost, even though I couldn't admit it to anyone else, not even myself. At that very moment, sitting alone in the late afternoon light, I knew momentarily that I was lost. I'm lost. I'm going to hell, I said. But the thought quickly evaporated. I took out the tract from the Burson woman's letter. It was entitled, "What is Life All About?" That was some question. I began to read. It made one quick point. Every person was meant to know God, to love Him, to serve Him. Life was to be lived with God through the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. I threw the letter back on the box and slept fitfully until supper time. Bud Mardock looked much as he had in my junior high school years in San Jose, casual and conservative, Still young looking, he seemed even more open than he had been as my school counselor. He sat opposite me at the visiting room table, leaning back in his straight chair and surveying me. "It's been a long time, Susan." "Yes." I wasn't sure what to say, but I didn't want him feeling sorry for me. I had to keep up the facade. "Things are pretty much the same in San Jose," he continued after a moment. It felt awkward. He didn't show it. I was amazed at how relaxed he seemed. "It's bigger and busier, and all in all, a lot the same. You'd feel right at home." "Not me." I smiled and spoke a bit too sharply. "School and I didn't really get along." "I know," he said, smiling broadly. "But it wasn't all that bad in junior high." "You're right," I conceded. "It wasn't all that bad at that point, but it was headed that way." He told me a lot about the kids I had grown up with, who was married to whom and who had gone where. He told me about his family, about his teaching career. And after half an hour, he said, "Susan, I feel I had to come down here to tell you something I should have spoken about before." He still seemed very relaxed, but a trifle shy at the moment. "I want to tell you about Jesus Christ." Sunk. Not him too. Everybody had flipped out. "I know Jesus Christ," I said, trying to remain cool. I looked him in the eyes, but they held level. "I'm glad," he said softly. He continued to look into my face. "I'd like for you to know that he loves you and can put your life back together for you. He did it for me." This was crazy. Kathy was right. Everybody was trying to save my soul, and I got on a high horse about it. Who did they think they were? "I hear you, Mr. Mardock. That's where I'm coming from. I'm with God. I believe in him. I'm on your side, but I'm doing it my way." He remained so very casual, almost loafish. There wasn't a trace of harshness or criticism on his face. This unsettled me and caused me to ramble on. "Jesus was all right, I really agree. He was a good man, a good teacher. He had a lot to teach mankind." Mardock waited patiently as I charged on, trying with all my might to hold up that facade. I suddenly realized he wasn't saying anything. He wasn't arguing back. I thought of Bruce. He didn't argue back either. He just laid things out calmly. A bit flustered, I pulled my elbows back off the table and placed my hands in my lap. "That's all true, Susan," he said at last, evenly, gently. But he was a whole lot more than that. He stopped, apparently expecting me to charge in again. I remained silent. "He was the Savior," he said. "He died for us. He took away our sins. He set us free. He wants us for himself, for his Father. He wants us to live the way we were meant to live, and he's made it all possible. All we have to do is accept it." There was a long silence. I could hear Pat and Leslie talking down the corridor. Outside, I could hear the birds and a flashing vision of the Saturday morning brightness outside the SSU walls. "I'm really into that kind of positive thinking, Mr. Mardock," I said as brightly as I could manage. "I hear your philosophy. It's all right. I've been doing a lot of thinking about God, and this Christ consciousness thing is really right on." I knew I had to get this guy off my back. He was a good man, and I didn't want to hurt him. The best thing to do was to agree with him and let the whole thing go. Mardock listened to me for several minutes. Then we talked about the weather, the musical scene, movies, and several small things. Finally, he got up from his chair and the visit was over. He was ready to walk out through the big steel doors, but he reached across the small table and grasped my hand. "I love you, Susan," he said softly, a smile flooding his face. "And Jesus loves you very, very much." I battled with all my strength to hold back tears. "Why don't you get the hell out of here?" I screamed within myself. But I said nothing. I think my face was blank. Summer was in full swing when Bruce became more pointed in his letters. We were writing almost every day. I was hitting him hard on what I detected as male chauvinism. I was even a little bit aware at the time that I was setting up a straw man, based partly on other people's opinions of Bruce 5 and 6 years earlier. Actually, I was trying to find a way to needle him and deflate his rather strong Christian posture. He didn't rattle easily. I was falling more and more in love with him, my old and predictable condition. He seemed to be so stable, and as always, I desperately wanted something to grab hold of. But I still kicked up my heels to try to establish a facade of independence, still wanting him to be more overt in his expressions of love to me. Bruce told me he loved me, but his expressions had a quality to them that I had not experienced. I sat on my bed on the last day of June and read page 3 of his most recent letter over and over. I didn't know if I liked it or not. He repeated his contention that he loved me, but then, it seemed to me, he muddied the waters. If he had to choose between my personally loving him and my experiencing the love and grace of God in Jesus, he said, he'd choose the latter and let his own desires go down the drain. His greatest purpose, he said, was to tell everybody he knew about his experiences and the love that Jesus gives. It was odd. That was as close as he ever came to telling me about his experiences. It sure sounded weird. The love that Jesus gives. What did that mean? Did Bruce love me or not? Never mind about the love that Jesus gives. No matter how much I pushed him, he wouldn't get explicit about what had happened to him. But something certainly had happened. This was definitely not the old Bruce from Spawn's Ranch. He was a new man. In August, as the country convulsed over the crazy and confusing Watergate affair, with President Richard Nixon finally resigning on the 9th of the month, Bruce's challenge of my thought processes and my trite and cliché-ridden philosophies intensified. He refused to tell me things, but he pricked and probed at my understanding and forced me to think for myself. Day after day, he laid before me good, reasonable thoughts about women's rights, children, grace, trust, nature, beauty, divine guidance, morality, marriage, gluttony, the Bible, love. But his most telling arguments centered on the subject of Jesus. I'm not sure if it was the force of his arguments or my receptivity to the subject matter itself, but something brought a new tenderness and a new understanding into my rattled brain when he spoke about Jesus. And he almost always used the name Jesus and not Christ. Even on paper, this seemed to make a difference. I felt the back of my neck tingling as Bruce told me that even he himself was not trustworthy. He couldn't even trust himself. But he said very simply, He did trust the love that Jesus had for him and the love Jesus showed through him. And furthermore, it was that Jesus, he wrote, who provided the way for a personal relationship between an individual and God. I remember that these words stung my eyes. He is a personal master or Lord or whatever they may call him. How could that be? He had to be crazy. But then he showed how Jesus had made the truth known to him in the Bible, how he had made it possible for him to end speculation and to grasp reality. And he then challenged me on the point with a suggestion that the next time I read the Bible, I should pray a short prayer asking that I find what I was looking for. Jesus will help you, he declared flatly. And then the clincher, Jesus. I could almost hear Bruce saying it flatly and evenly in that soft drawl of his. Jesus is not a concept or a philosophy or a religion. Jesus is. I stopped when I read that. Jesus is. Jesus is. Jesus is. It sounded okay any way you said it, but I wasn't sure I knew what it meant, and the tenderness only lasted a few moments. With hindsight, I see I was so nervous and jittery as Bruce hit closer and closer to my conscience that I flared back with everything possible to divert him. At one point, I even went to a lengthy and crude speculation on the love life of Jesus. It made no sense and contained no truth. It was past midnight when I dropped off to sleep one hot, muggy night late in August. My brain was sore from its gymnastics with Bruce, Hal Lindsey, and God. I plunged into a deep sleep right away, and I began to dream. I was in a playground. In the middle of the scene of swings, slides, and seesaws lay a dead person. I strained to see who it was. It was Bobby. Why was he here? And dead? What had happened to him? Suddenly, the scene changed. The playground was gone, and I was in a huge room, bigger than any I'd ever seen. Masses of people filled the room. It was a sea of people. They picked me up over their heads and started walking with me, carrying me somehow out of the big room and out into the open. There in the big open space, wide and colorful, clean and pure, was something, a being. It wasn't a human, but it wasn't an animal. It was a being, and all the people began falling down and bowing down before it. What were they doing? I soon realized they were worshiping the being. That must be God, I heard myself saying. Beautiful plants were growing out of the ground. They were everywhere. Everything was beautiful. And the being walked around stepping on the beautiful plants. But he didn't hurt them. They came right back up into their beautiful shape. Everything was beautiful. The being was talking, but I couldn't understand it. What am I doing here? I heard myself saying. This guy is really on a trip. My voice dripped with arrogance. The being then walked over and tapped me on the head, right on top of my head. He was larger than I realized. He looked into my face and said, "The trouble with you is your indifference to me. I want you to think about your indifference." I was instantly awake. My heart was in my throat, and I felt I might choke. Perspiration covered my body, but nonetheless I felt chilly. I was afraid and cold.